Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Are you a mental health professional looking to deepen your clinical expertise in healing complex trauma? We're thrilled to announce our 2025 NARM Therapist trainings designed to provide you with transformative training in the NeuroAffective Relational Model. In 2025, we're offering 3 Level 2 NARM Therapist trainings, 2 live online cohorts, and 1 in-person training in Scottsdale, Arizona. Both the in-person Scottsdale training and the spring online cohort begin in January of 2025, and the summer online cohort begins in May of 2025. These NARM Therapist trainings consist of 4 weekend modules spread out over the year. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to confidently and compassionately heal the impact of adverse childhood experiences and CPTSD. You'll gain specialized training in a relationally focused, neurobiologically informed clinical approach that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. And you'll be joining a dynamic community that offers multiple learning opportunities to deepen your professional and personal growth. Enrollment is open to licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, and other licensed mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. Visit ComplexTraumaTrainingCenter.com to register for the 2025 NARM Therapist training that best fits your schedule. We hope you will join us to learn how NARM can transform your practice. And now for our interview. James McNinch is a licensed clinical social worker with over 16 years of experience developing some of the most high-profile and influential trauma-focused treatment centers in Malibu and across the globe. James is currently an instructor at the University of Southern California, while also developing NARM-AC with Dr. Laurence Heller. In addition, James is the clinical director of Grata House and Ranch in Thousand Oaks, California, that utilizes Dr. Heller's and McNinch's state-of-the-art approach, NARM-AC, of treating the relational trauma that causes impulsivity and addiction. James provides individual therapy virtually and in person to California residents from his offices in Westlake Village and Los Angeles. His approach is heartfelt, connected, and life-affirming. Please enjoy my conversation with James McNinch. All right, I am so happy to welcome James McNinch. We're so happy to have you on Transforming Trauma.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So, as I always do, I'd love to start with asking you, what would you like our listeners to get from our conversation today?
I guess what I most want to see or happen for them and for myself throughout this is just the ability to connect of, what's possible in healing trauma and addiction. There's so many resources. There's so many modalities. There's so much in the media that people could really feel like they could change their lives in a meaningful way where they wouldn't have to rely on a strategy as addiction and experience, as we say in NARM, more aliveness, more connectedness, and trust their ability to connect with themselves and with others and share that with the people in their lives. I think that would be a beautiful thing. And that's what I'm most wanting. And I think a lot of people want that for themselves and for others. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being here. And, I always love to know the guests that we have, how you came to the field, what brought you to this work, and why is it important to you?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's, me seeking most of my life that, I come from a place that's not so organized and put together. And I think it's like through seeking, I've really found, and I've started out my life, young professional working in tech. And I found that to be longing. There's something missing. I worked for a big software company that you've probably heard of, and startups within that, products within that. There's this thing called the Idea Box. It was in our department. We create stuff like Xbox or whatever. And our manager said, hey, if you have a really good idea for something that can revolutionize the world, put it in the Idea Box, write it down, just slip it in here. And I just thought, there's nothing happening here. There's nothing happening that truly satisfies. I have a lot of things in my life that are materialized, and yet I felt a longing. And at that time, I was using my own strategies to get through things that I separated myself from and hidden from myself. I just thought, there's something missing. And I went through my own process of recovery from those strategies and ended up moving from tech. And I thought, well, this is heading in a certain way where it's going to be a dominating thing. And what's something that will never fade in its connection. And so I started out as a counselor for a 12-step publishing company and answering calls from people, and found myself having very meaningful experiences and being paid nothing. And it led me to a career of going into clinical social work at Arizona State, and it was a very good experience. I thought, this is not what I saw for my life. And, I was working down on the humanitarian crisis on the border in Arizona, and a lot of the patients who were refugees and coming from Iraq at the war at that time. And, I started working with a lot of addiction and a lot of crisis situations out in the field with agencies. And that kind of brought me to an emotional reckoning within my life of like, how is this like the family system without strategies of addiction, that I'm doing all this service, and yet I find myself in a place where I feel this fear that I'm familiar with and kind of thrive in, and dissociation and all these things. And, it kind of brought me to this place of, as they say with the helping profession, it's like heal thyself. Like I found myself bringing myself to a place where I couldn't get between me and me anymore. And I had to look at that in some life-threatening situations, like what's really happening here? What's occurring? About that time, I came out to California for like a writing fellowship at UCLA, and somehow my resume got passed along that I'd worked with little resources helping people, and I had a pretty good effect. And some of the rehab centers got hold of this information, and some of these centers were having like a lot of fatality rates due to substance, and they thought, this guy's doing something out in the field that's producing these outcomes with centers, and how could we do that here? We're supposed to be the best out in Malibu and kind of the flagship. And so they hired me to come in and help restructure a lot of their philosophies. And back then it was kind of like a Minnesota social model only, come in, do some Gorski or some, and that stuff's very helpful, go to AA and learn that, and, use psychotherapies to kind of talk about your past and go into an excavation that way. And then after 30 days, you go home. And a lot of them were relapsing immediately, or there's fatalities and all these things. And so they had to mitigate risk. And I helped them with that to start introducing the trauma short-term model. And they were terrified of it. They wanted it, but they were like, it's kind of like the nuclear bomb when they first detonate. They're like, is this just going to keep going? Or does it like, so they were terrified. And, we started introducing old school stuff like EMDR and some of these short-term brief trauma therapy models, and started working with addiction. And then I came across a colleague held up Dr. Heller's book in 2013 and said, I got something here. This is really something else. And I picked it up and I read it and I was blown away. So that's kind of how I came to this work.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone handed you the book. And what about it really landed for you?
Very good question, Emily. I think what really stood out was how heartfelt it is, how it looked at child and adult consciousness. And I thought, this arrested development and the way it's carefully and skillfully going into uncovering the phenomenon of what's really happening underneath all these behaviors is really something I'd never seen or heard before. I'd known Fitzgerald's work and Wilhelm Reich around phenomenology, and I really started to understand reading that book how the strategy of addiction, is really this vast experience of dealing with the pain of authentic disconnection from the self and the need to avoid relational loss with caregivers. And that just blew my mind and brought it full circle with Wilhelm Reich and Fitzgerald. I thought, these people are craving necessary experience to deal with that inauthenticity, and that there's a way to work with that that's phenomenological, that I can start working with somebody and watch them start to burst through dissociation and experience, like I've had clients just come out of it in session and kind of break through these layers of dissociation, which alcohol and drug abuse is a layer of that. And just them look at me and say, oh my God, like I've never been here before, and just kind of breathe some air like in this space. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. Yeah.
I love that. When you're working with clients in that space, how do you how do you hold complex trauma? Do you talk to them about it? Is there like some element of, is it more experiential, or do you kind of guide them into that? I'm so curious what that looks like in your space.
I mean, that's what I love about NARM and this new NARM-AC model that, Dr. Heller and I are collaborating on and writing up, is that there's the autonomy and agency to lead me into that. Like as a psychotherapist, I don't have to talk at them about their behaviors and be reductive or anything. It's, I have a lot of gray hair from all this EMDR, from and CBT and all these things I've been doing. But the beautiful thing is that they're coming to their own conclusions. All I'm doing is just holding that attachment space and allowing them to have the choice to stay in that phenomenology and reminding them of what's happening. And they're like, something's happening. And I'm like, yes. And you don't have to stay there with it. You can leave, or just giving them that option of having autonomy of how much they can handle in that moment and to go away and come back allows them the freedom to start working with trusting that their experience is not going to kill them. And the deepest part of the question you're asking, I think, is this experience, particularly people who struggle with addiction, is, what's your relationship with anger? That's what I always ask them. What's your relationship with anger? And they're typically so disconnected from their anger that they're like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm nice. Even 30 years sober, they're like, I'm a nice, of service person. Like, anger is like a problem. I don't deal with anger anymore. But if you look at addiction and the violence against self, if I explore it in like a non-shaming way with them, and they can kind of hold that this is a strategy they've used to disconnect because they had to, and stay connected with their caregiver in a way of relating, that this adaptive way of relating has allowed them to survive their life. And as soon as they become aware of it, they're like, oh, but I'm not living as I should, right? So that shame base comes in. It's like, sweetheart, of course you're not, like, it's okay. Letting them know, like, it's not really a good or bad thing, that it was a matter of survival. And this shame base, they start to realize that there's deep rage against themselves, and they start to feel that. They feel safe enough to start letting it start to happen. All of a sudden, they're working at the root of their addiction because the violence is not being turned in on self and it's not being acted out in the outside world. I love that saying from, I think it's Rumi, that, do not seek love, seek only to remove the obstacles that stand in the way of it. And I think that somebody's need to feel the unexpressed rage around their needs not being met creates a new phenomenon of possibility, a new beginning for them.
Yeah, I love that piece, in my first NARM training, where this idea of like discovering who I am by first understanding who I'm not, when Dr. Heller talks about that, I was like, that's something that blew my mind. I was like, oh, because that's really clear for me. I'm realizing more and more every day in these situations, I'm becoming more disidentified with these things that I'm like, that's not actually who I am. And that stuff was clearer to me first, but then I would be like, well, who am I? And that was like fuzzy. So I appreciate what you're naming there of like figuring out, this kind of core self lands a little easier when we're like, well, what am I not? And connecting with love, is like removing all those barriers first. That's how we can connect.
Disidentification and the identification, people in addiction are struggling with, they're terribly missing themselves. And I think that's why individuals that work in the strategy of addiction with coping with that pain, it's like they feel it's the only possibility for themselves. And so that's why I think when people come to the ends of their addiction, where they're contemplating getting sober, it's like there's a choice between disconnection from a way of relating to people that might not even be here anymore, but, families, caregivers, or, going on drinking, and yet they're facing all these consequences. And so the idea of suicide and things like that often come up. How many sessions I've been in with people where, they'll get to that place and it's almost like that child consciousness surfacing and be like, oh, I'd just rather die. I would just rather not be here, because it's like, it would almost feel in that child fantasy that it would be easier just to depart, because that way it's not losing your family by becoming your authentic self, and one becoming their authentic self and not kind of staying in that obedience of disconnectedness of the addiction. Or it's on the other end of the spectrum of like going on in the behaviors and then feeling that I'm behaving in this child consciousness, and yet I'm an adult, and all the shame about that these things are being uncovered by people and it's being exposed and it feels so vulnerable and unsafe to have this strategy being like really uncovered, that there's so much shame that it would feel in a child's fantasy, it'd be almost easy just to disappear. It'd be far easier just to just get out of here. And so that's like when working with people, my patients, helping them understand that phenomenology and normalizing that. Like, of course, I see how it could feel easier just to leave. And then it's almost like, well, if you stayed right here, right now, it's that fundamental question, what would you most want for yourself? And it's like they get into this fugue of confusion. And it's almost like I normalize that and just say, and here we are in this confusion. This is new. This could be new possibilities. And it's almost like what unfolds from there is a new state of being where they start feeling safe in that confusion. And it's like, oh, well, we don't know what's happening here. And there's all this curiosity instead of the shame base. It's just beautiful to watch because they're experiencing a sense of themselves that they've closed off and hidden from most of their lives. They could be 80, they could be 16 years old in the strategy of addiction. And so, it's amazing when we use this work in our centers. Our work right now is a Grata House. It's a place that Dr. Heller and I have. And, we've had many patients, and I've worked in many treatment centers where it's a 20% success rate of that 30 days of treatment, right? And so it's almost like everyone doesn't want to acknowledge that that's the realities that, the patients, the families, the practitioners. What's beautiful in the NARM-AC model, which is the NARM Addiction Center model, is when we're working at a place like Grata House, and we're using the NARM-AC model, is that when patients experience that sense of themselves, I see these younger kids that are on fentanyl, these almost kind of like, murder drugs. It's like there's something that's happening where they experience it. And the beautiful thing is it gives them hope and they stay longer. They connect deeper. They feel something that's possible versus us all staying in denial together as the family, the practitioner, the patient. It's like, oh yeah, 28 days, one and done, you're out. In this new model, it's like, of our patients, and probably every addiction treatment center would say this, right? We have a 90% success rate of our patients. And the few that have gone out and relapsed, the NARM-AC model, they call right back and come right back in. They're all in treatment right now, and they all have 90 days or 6 months or whatever. But of the patients that are the 90%, they've all been successful. And they're dealing with fentanyl. They're coming off methadone, which are the hardest drugs. Wow. And our whole thing is like, what do you most want to see happen? What do you need right now? Getting down to that humanistic core where they feel safe enough to admit where they are. And they can show that child consciousness and be like, I don't know. Wow. That's why I'm excited about NARM, in the addiction treatment world, because it's not reductionist. It's like, oh, I'm taking this away. Just keep it away. Just not do that, right? Or social models, just keep yourself so busy or distracted that it works, But during a pandemic, we saw people with 30, 40 years relapsing like crazy. Why? They only had the social model. They didn't have an integrated self. And same thing with these people that I've seen, that when they go from that reductionistic mindset, is that oftentimes they're trying to keep something away and they have no possibility of a new experience within inside themselves. Wow. That's what the drug is it's creating this phenomenon within themselves when they can deal with disconnecting from themselves and then hold their current relationships, even if it's a poor way of relating, that they have a need met in that way,
Yeah, there's a few things that you said there that just are really landing for me. One of them being this piece of like normalizing the confusion. And I love how you said that, like, oh, this is cool. This is new possibility. Like, you don't know what's going to happen next. And every other time you probably did, because there was this cycle that you were tracking. And so kind of relating to it in a totally different way of like, well, this could actually be good. I love that. And then this other piece of like, I don't know the words to say it, but it's not like just the chemical dependence that you're looking at from the drug. It's like there's this whole other, that root cause of what's the disconnection. Like, can we look at that? Like addressing that just seems so much more holistic and real, to be frank.
It is. I love your frankness, and to kind of go with that, I think like a lot of people in addiction, there's a very dualistic mindset. It's whiskey or it's wine or it's stimulants. And so there's the whole thing. It's like, is it social? Is it internal? Right. And so what we really like to do in the NARM-AC model is, explore that dualism and getting into that confusion around having another option, right? When people come in and they're in that dual mindset, it's very limiting, right? And you see that in models of addiction today that treat, not to bash anything that's out there right now, but we're still in the dark ages of this thing. And we're really we need something to show up right now, right? We need something to show up right now. And there's lots of great things, Sublocade and Brixadi and all these new wonder drugs that are combating fentanyl. I mean, it's amazing, right? But most psychiatrists and doctors, if you ask them what that is, they don't know what that is. They're starting to learn this stuff, right? So we're really playing catch up with the best we got. But the beautiful thing in NARM and working with all these other medication-assisted treatments and philosophies is that we did do some things right. We did some things really right in the first recovery model, which is the Minnesota model, the social model of 12-step, is that crew of 12 people and Bill W., they had a really great philosophy of this working in an altruistic plane of existence, of helping others. And there's something transmitting there. There's connection and there's accountability. And there's also this kind of like psychic change that comes from that classic process of 12 steps and all these things, right? They kind of borrowed all these things and an amalgam created, this conscious shifting thing. But really, it's really mind identified and it's social identified. And so what I see its limitations are, and I think that Bill W. really did a good job of spelling that out, is in the social model, I think that their philosophy is service, unity, and recovery, right? That's kind of their pillars. And so you have a social aspect, an internalized recovery aspect, and then a service aspect, right? That when all those things are going, that creates sobriety and all those things. So I think that's a beautiful model. And I think that, its limitations we saw, as I said earlier, in the pandemic, when there wasn't that socialized aspect, that there's not an individuation and an internalized aspect to it. And I think that that's what NARM-AC does, is it complements, right now at our treatment centers, all these guys are utilizing the social model and they're having an immense experience with themselves and, they're doing a 12-step, right? And it's very useful to use all these things all together in unison. That most drugs introduced in the market and stuff, they're usually combined in the research with some kind of social model. What I would say is in addiction and using NARM is that getting out of that dualism of the internalized work and socialized, it's kind of like if somebody can get out of this icy intellectual fugue of the head and start to deeply embody, that's a place where we've never been to, integrated with a social model and medication-assisted treatment that we're doing here at Grata House. The results are just amazing. And what I can say is that I think in the future going forward, these new possibilities that we're finding is looking at the addiction models of what's come before us. And, Bill W. would probably be our greatest advocate. He said in a 1960 something letter, it's in the AA archive, and somebody read it to me and it made my jaw drop. He said, when I created Alcoholics Anonymous, I made a mistake. He said that, I created Alcoholics Anonymous based on the need to treat the biological alcoholic. And he said, now through these many years, I realized that there's this large body of AA that's both socialized and biologically predisposed to this thing. And he's like, and even greater, I realize that there's this huge mass of humanity who's really not even biological alcoholic, which makes up most of AA, and they're nearly all socialized for it. And this really touched me. He said that I would have been better off to call Alcoholics Anonymous Neurotics Anonymous, because I realize now that these people, these fellows, have internalized the neuroses of their parents, and they're just perpetuating the cycle. And he's like, I really feel that AA in 100 or 200 years won't be called AA. It'll migrate into something else.
Oh, interesting.
Which I think that 12-step model is beautiful, because if you're rolling a car over and you need to focus on behaviors, I mean, social support and accountability is beautiful, right? But at the same time, with the failures that we have in substance use and, creating actually something that's phenomenologically different to that craving of alcohol and that, powerlessness that people really do experience when they only have one strategy, and creating a new phenomenon. It's like when they take that first drink, something wakes up in them that is warm inclusive, loving, roomy, spacious. And if they're experiencing that in the session, and they've never experienced that ever in their life, only from the effect produced by alcohol or drugs, it gives them something that they can't untaste. And they want more. And so that's why we're seeing such outcomes, because patients, okay, they make a mistake, they come right back in because they've experienced something safe where, the trauma-based short-term models we've used or social models we've used out in Malibu or whatever, we've seen patients go out and stay out for 6 months or years. They get a divorce, someone dies, horrible stuff because they don't have that hope. So that's what we're really finding. And that's really fascinating to me.
It's interesting. As you were talking, it made me think of, I heard in one of our trainings, someone had said that there was a client who described NARM as like a psychedelic, like all the good, like I'm having an experience here that feels kind of otherworldly.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what you're naming. Like this really, it feels really sacred for a lot of folks in that space, and that it kind of transcends, something that people are looking for. So, yeah.
Well, I love that you brought up psychedelics. It's such a conversation piece, especially here in the addiction rehabs and stuff like that. Everyone's looking for the magic bullet. And I think that there are immensely useful qualities to these things. What I would say to that is, you're right. Like in the sessions, people are experiencing a phenomenon that's otherworldly. The ancient yogis call it Shakti-Ananda, eternal bliss ecstasy, that there's something wonderful inside of us, no matter who we are. We all have this deep intrinsic value. If we allow what's possible within ourselves in a supportive, attached, deeply connected way, and we're like seeing ourselves and reflected back through someone else, like the gaze of love and unconditional acceptance, and then something starts transmitting, right? That I've sat in many sessions and patients and saying, there's something happening. And I'll say, instead of me interjecting and trying to handle or try to push, it's allowing the space to let it happen organically, where they're coming into something and they're feeling autonomy, trust, connection. And that leads into this whole vitality, like we say in NARM, that allows for what's wonderful to happen. Shakti-Ananda, eternal bliss ecstasy. And it's like, if someone gets a little taste of that, you're right, it is like an otherworldly experience. But what if that, in my own work, I've experienced that when I was first coming into this work. I've experienced that, and you can't, bliss out all day, but I do experience something wonderful in each moment. And although there's peaks and there's valleys, it's kind of like that key attachment that I return to within myself. And all I'm doing is allowing somebody else to have that within themselves. And I'm sure in your own practice, you've, connected with people, and you can't believe what was impossible a moment ago is just, there's no limits. And that's a different state of being. And I think that in working with anger, that's the beautiful thing. I'll say, what's your relationship with anger? And they'll say, oh, I don't have it. Or, oh, I acted out, right? There's these dualisms, two extremes, right? What I notice is that when they allow authentic rage to start coming up, and I mean like rage, like there's needs that have not been met their whole lives. And it's almost like a murderous rage, and they feel so unsafe with it, and to be seen in it and to reflect that back and be like, yes, 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 yes. It's almost like a little kid. It's like that child consciousness is getting so affirmed that, yes, there's a lot of needs that haven't been met. And there's a lot of frustrations that they start feeling safe to use that rage in a titrated approach of healthy motivation. A lot of these guys get sober and gals get sober, and their first statement is like, oh, I'm a procrastinator, or, oh, I can't do these things. But that muscle memory within their body, and their kind of language in their heart versus the stuck place in their head, when they start to embody and it starts to create an experience, they feel that they can actually use some of that rage to motivate to meet their needs. And that would be a new way of relating to their caregivers and their worldview at large.
Yeah, instead of completely cutting off from it and not having access to like the spark or the life force that is behind that, like you say, relating to it in a new way where it's actually useful.
Well, I think that when we talk about addiction, we talk about behaviors and efforting, right? Like like you just said, what's useful. And I think people feel useless when they're in this addiction. So that shame-based identification of And that pride-based identification that we talk about in NARM, as far as feeling like almost this falsity pride, where it's like I'm greater than, but yet, I'm not worth it, right? And so it kind of vacillates. So that getting out of that, again, that dualistic thinking and getting into equanimity in that middle part, it often allows them to make, choice and agency where they can come to their own conclusions. That's why I think, bringing something like motivational interviewing a little bit into NARM-AC is kind of like, oh, well, you have good reasons for being here. Like, please expand. And actually, how did you come to your own conclusion on that? Because that's really remarkable that you're aware of this, because that's that ambivalence of addiction of like pride-based identification, and then which is like a falsity pride, not a healthy pride, and then a shame-based identification of like, oh yeah, I'm not good enough. Wait, I'm better than, and I'm not good enough. And so if we can get it into a middle spot, oftentimes that's where agency and healing will start happening, because they'll allow for support to happen, because they have to have the freedom to come to their own conclusions in these decisions.
Right.
Forcing them into treatment by XYZ behavior or boundaries. Boundaries are beautiful and they work, but sometimes with an addict, they can get into almost like an enabling situation where the boundaries are being crashed and then walls go up. And then next thing you know, there's abandonment and there's all these behaviors and stuff, and it's cyclical. And in the NARM-AC model, the beautiful thing is allowing for somebody to come to their own conclusion outside of that pride-based identification. That's more of a healthy, balanced pride. And so there's real stopping power in that they can tolerate the good decisions and the affect that they're experiencing versus having to escape that or jump into the old way of relating to mom or dad or husband or wife, where they're seeing these punitive things and they're being reactionary to these instances, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Beautiful. You've mentioned the NARM-AC model, and we're
Right.
like hearing some really cool stuff. And I wonder, could you get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of it? Tell us a little bit more maybe about how you came to start developing this. What is it? Is it fully developed? Is it still kind of in process? Where are you at with that?
Oh, Dr. Heller and I met some time back, and we've been kind of talking about exploring it. And we decided to do these centers as a pilot test for it. Right now, we're writing the manuscript of the book, which will be published likely sometime in the fall. And so as we're writing it, the nuts and bolts, it's interesting because NARM doesn't really get into behaviors and socialization boundaries and things like that. It does in a sense, but that we're exploring some new territory. So Dr. Heller and I are really feeling this out in terms of a practical approach of, accountability, social support, boundaries, existing things like the 12 steps of motivational interviewing, integrated with, connection, trust, autonomy, all these styles and pillars that NARM has really broke ground on. And of course, that phenomenological approach. So with the NARM-AC model, I guess that's where we are right now, is we're just in the manuscript and pretty deep into on-the-job training, like opening these centers and seeing the results and kind of like slowly starting to get this information out to people so that we can get feedback from our clients and make sure we're doing an ethical job of relaying accurate information and outcomes.
Oh, I appreciate the transparency there. It's in process.
Mm-hmm.
You're working with it and getting the feedback and the data back to see what's working. So that's so exciting. And I know there's going to be a lot of folks to be excited to hear about this model and the book that sounds like it's coming here in the next year, and super exciting. Do you have any work with clients or stories of where there's been struggle that might help share this inspiration, what you've experienced and what clients have experienced with our listeners?
Yeah, I could give kind of a vignette that, I've worked with a lot of treatment-resistant patients that have done 180 treatment centers or 40 or whatever it is, and they haven't stayed past a week of detox and have just hit the streets or hit the plane back home or whatever. And I haven't had that here. Everyone has stayed. Everyone has stayed. And what I can say is that there was a gentleman who has a torture survivor. Awful, awful, awful. I mean, the darkest of the dark. People would think it's throwaway, and, what this man has experienced is awful, and it's a tragedy. And so I have deep compassion for that. And he hit it under being a high power executive. The addiction helped him cope with that. And he's tried many, many treatment centers. And I saw him in 2018 as he started to experiment with the NARM-AC model. A lot of drug counselors and family therapists and whoever would kind of join him in his denial and say, this is going to be great. This is, there's something good coming down, and it's true that there was eventually. But I just sat down and I said, it's okay. You're probably going to relapse after this. And that's okay. That's okay. And we just shared in the grief right when he's in the middle of pain for he's paying to get the magic bullet to walk out of rehab and to be good. And I just was like, I'm just going to share the space of where you are and not have a judgment, even if you did go back. And he looked at me and he had hope in his eyes where he's like, you know what? Thank you. And this is the only time anyone's ever told me that it's okay. And I didn't ask them to join me in my denial. And I really trust you. So it's that first connection piece and that trust piece of that NARM-AC model where that guy, no matter how dark it got, out in Palm Springs, slamming crystal meth and, numerous sex partners and, all the shame and, and then him calling me just screaming and crying and say, I'm going to die, and when we opened up our center, he was actually our first client and he came in and just the terror. I'm not even talking fear, Emily. I'm talking just the terror of how he wanted to stop and couldn't stop. And yet that if he did stop, that there would be no other possibility. And yet because of that, allowing him to be who he is in that moment of saying that, like, how could it be any other way? It's okay. I know it's okay. And just him looking back and being like, yeah, this is the only thing I got. And then him coming into treatment using that kind of spiritualized defenses and then intellectual, the guy's genius. It's just all these defenses that he has around what he knows, that mind identification, and yet the disembodiment and all the dissociation and the torture and everything that was like stuck. Once that started coming up and he felt safe enough to embody and let what needed to flow, maybe flow, the somatic symptoms and everything was out of this world. And I just got why this guy touched drugs to a place where, it was killer. It was going to take him. And like to be understood in that and to be held in that and then to let go of that control to gain a new sense of trust. I think that's where really NARM-AC has come in and was deeply impactful. And he stayed. And he stayed 90 days. And he just was our speaker like a couple weeks ago. And he has a huge life and he's a beautiful, beautiful man. And he's healing his sexuality and all the strategies he's had to use as, a gay man growing up in the 80s when, just the systemic, familial, and he's taking his time and staying connected. He's taking a year of his life to work, and earn money and everything, but to work too and to be gentle and kind of that mantra we use in NARM-AC. It's like, sweetheart, take your time, love yourself, and hurry up. So it's kind of like this very adult, very child consciousness way of holding somebody delicate. And he's just thriving. And our medical staff saw him and was just like, oh my God, because he was one of the hardest clients to deal with all of his avoidance symptoms. And they couldn't believe how he came across. And it was both parts. It was, like we say, it was the service, the recovery, the unity, but also was this deep phenomenological change where there's something happening deep within himself and there's no need to spiritualize or intellectualize, and the defense was gone. That's one that makes me smile.
Yeah, I got chills as you were sharing that. What a beautiful, it just kind of encapsulates what I imagine you were hoping for in opening up a center. Wow. Thank you so much for that. What else would you like to kind of share with listeners around this NARM-AC model?
I would say, how could things be any other way? That there is something wonderful in all of us and that NARM is an approach to access that. In the NARM-AC model, I think that it gives hope to a place where the door has been darkened by addiction, that there is hope and possibilities of something wonderful coming out of this, that people's trauma as it relates to an addiction strategy can be healed, that this organic process of developing this thing with Dr. Heller has really given me hope. And I just want to share that with other people. And help people on their journeys. And I know that Dr. Heller feels the same way, and he's touched, millions of people with his model. And just to let people know that someday that there could be new possibilities for them, and to hold on, and that good things are on the way. And that my journey is different, but in a way, I think it's a lot of the same, that I have experienced a lot of what they've experienced, and now I experience something totally different within myself. And I mean, that's what NARM and this work has done. So I'm just immensely grateful to be involved in any capacity, and to be here with Dr. Heller's and Brad's podcast with you, Emily. I'm just like, wow, because since 2013, I've been a huge fan, and I never expected this for my life. So I want people to know that no matter where they are, something great can happen. And thank you for having me.
Beautiful. As we close, I'm wondering, how can folks find you? People are hearing this and they're feeling touched, they're feeling moved, they're curious. Where can people find the work that you're doing and all of that good stuff?
Great question. I have a website called gratahouse.com. That's where our center is. And if you want to go there and check us out and kind of read about what we do, and there's, going to be some media on there pretty soon. Also, there's NARM Therapy LA, which is like my private practice. And if you want to go on there, it's very basic, very chill. And of course, the book that's coming out, the NeuroAffective Relational Model Addiction Center, that'll be out in the fall.
Beautiful. Thank you again, James. You've been so generous with your time and your energy. Really appreciate the work that you're doing in the world.
All right. Thanks, Emily. Nice to meet you. Take care.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We hope you're as excited as we are about the upcoming 2025 NARM Therapist trainings. Whether you choose the in-person training in Scottsdale, Arizona, or one of our live online cohorts, this advanced clinical training in the NeuroAffective Relational Model will transform your practice. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to effectively address complex trauma and facilitate post-traumatic growth. You'll gain specialized training in a relationally focused, neurobiologically informed clinical approach that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. You'll also be joining a dynamic community that offers multiple learning opportunities to deepen your professional and personal growth. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to register for the 2025 NARM Therapist training that best fits your schedule. We hope you will join us in this special opportunity to advance your clinical practice and make a lasting impact on the lives of those you serve. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.